I'm Shauna, and today we are going to be talking about making a woven tank. I have a free pattern for the woven tank that I'm going to be using on my website. It's for children's age, starting at 12 months, going to size 18. You can also use these same techniques that we're going to be using on any tank top pattern that you have that you love for yourself or for anybody else, or anytime you're taking a knit pattern and adapting it for woven use. Then you can add the things like the neck placket and how to finish the binding is what some of the things that we're going to be really covering today. So the first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about fabrics with you. We're going to be using a woven fabric, and a woven fabric, much like this example, although this is not the fabric I'm going to be using for my tank top, it's similar. Woven fabrics are strings, like we have here, that are woven together, and so they have a grain line in them that runs up and down and side to side in the fabric. And woven fabric doesn't have any stretch or give, although some of them might have just a little bit of give, if you will. They don't have stretch to them. They're a nice stable fabric, and they're great for especially beginning to sew. I used to only sew with woven fabrics. Knits kind of scared me, and now that no fabric scares me, I sew with knits a lot, but I still have a love for woven fabrics, so I often go back to them. And this is an example of a knit fabric, just so that you can see what I'm talking about with the stretch. So knit fabric, they are knit together like you would knit a sweater. So if you pay close attention to the how it's woven together, if you ever examine your knit fabrics, you'll see that it really does look like a sweater knit together, and it's done by machines, which is pretty cool. But knit fabric has stretch to it, often two ways. Sometimes it's only a two-way stretch, sometimes it's four-way stretch, sometimes it stretches in every single direction. So that will depend on the type of knit that you're working with. This particular knit stretches in every direction, although side to side has a bit more stretch. I'm not going to talk a lot about stretch fabrics, or stretch percentages, or all that, because we're not going to be dealing with stretch fabrics. But that is the difference between the two. So any fabric or pattern that calls for knit fabrics, the reason they're calling for a knit fabric is because the fabric has stretch or give to it. So the pattern is drafted and designed in a way that they are anticipating the fabric to be able to stretch and move with the body. Whereas a woven fabric or pattern is designed to lay over the body and not have to stretch and give with the body. And that's the biggest difference. However, if you have a pattern that is a drapey fit or a loose fit, even if it calls for a knit, you can easily adapt it to work for a woven fabric. The changes you're going to have to make are usually the fact that it's not going to stretch over the head, so adding a placket, which I'm going to show you in my instructions. And then most of them have knit bindings, and knit bindings stretch to fit, but we're going to do bias bindings for this tank top. So I will show you in the video how to cut on the bias, but when you cut a woven on the bias, while this had no stretch side to side, if you stretch on the diagonal, there's a little bit more give to the fabric. And almost every woven fabric out there, when stretched on the diagonal, has just a little bit of give. So you're still not stretching these to fit with the bindings, but that give is what allows it to go over a curved edge. So if we were to cut this straight, then we'd go over that curved edge and it would buckle and pucker, and we don't want that. So I am going to walk you through all the steps with the tank top, and hopefully by the end you will have the skills you need to make a great woven tank top, and adapt those same skills to take a t-shirt pattern and make it into a woven tee if you want. The only other note I'm going to add, because I do miss it in my video, is interfacing. Interfacing is something I often use with a woven fabric. It helps to kind of stabilize. I only ever do it when I'm adding buttonholes or snaps or anything else, because the fabric itself is often not thick enough or heavy enough to carry the weight of the snap. So I will often use a lightweight interfacing. You would otherwise use it with collars or other things that you need to kind of like keep their shape. But I do use it for my placket. I use interfacing on the back side of the placket. I kind of skip over that a little bit in the video. I mentioned it really briefly, but that is the other thing. It's usually iron on. You just cut it the same size as your placket piece and then iron it onto the back. The only other thing I wanted to discuss before we jump into the video is seam finishing. Again, I kind of glaze over it a little bit in the video, but when it comes to seam finishing, as you can see here with a woven fabric, the edges are going to unravel and all these little strings, if you can see those, are going to come out of your seams. And so there are a couple ways that you can prevent that from happening. Whereas with a knit fabric, the edge is not going to unravel at all. I mean, the most a knit will do is kind of curl at the edge. And so you can technically leave that completely unfinished inside the garment. I usually finish my knits as well, just because I like the look of it, but you don't have to with a knit, you do with a woven. Those are some of the differences. Some of the things I will use is my serger back here. If you have one or have access to a serger, it's great. You just zip the fabric through and it puts an interlocking stitch on the edge that keeps your garment from fraying, which is wonderful. But if you don't have that, there are a couple other things that you can do, and you can do bias tape, which is the same method that I'm going to show you with the bias bounding, and you can bias bind your seams, which takes a little bit more work, a little bit more patience, and can be a little bulky. So another option is to use pinking shears, and pinking shears are these like zigzaggy shears, and then when you cut the fabric, it kind of zigzags the fabric for you. So then it's kind of like having them cut on the bias. And essentially with these, how we're seeing like strings just flying up, I can pull this and it's not fraying. I mean, it gets ever so slightly fuzzy, but it's not fraying. So it holds up pretty well. So using pinking shears is probably the most inexpensive, beginner-friendly way to finish a woven seam. The only way pinking shears, or thing that pinking shears don't work great on, is if you were working with like a silk or some other kind of looser woven fabric. Pinking shears aren't great for that. But if you're a beginner and you're just trying out or working with woven fabrics for the first time, I don't recommend those fabrics anyway. So pinking shears can be your friend. The other thing you can do is like French seams and other things. So you can Google a video for how to do French seams if you'd like. Again, they're just ever so slightly more bulky, so I prefer either pinking shears or the serger if you have that availability. And like I say, I will mention it briefly in the video as well for when you would want to finish those seams. With the tank top, there are very few seams that you need to finish since we are bias binding most of the openings. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right in and learn how to make a woven tank top, okay?
Okay, so to get started, I just want to talk a little bit about the fabric. We have two grain lines in fabric. It goes up and down and side to side. And then there is the bias, and the bias is what we're going to cut all of our bias bands on. And that just means that we're going to be cutting diagonally. So to do that, we're going to fold the fabric so that the two grains cross each other, kind of like so as we've done. And then I put the straight line against the straight line on my board here so that I can cut strips. And I like to cut my strips to be about 1.5 inches wide. You can go as wide as 2 inches. You could go as narrow as 1 inch, but you have to remember that there's seam allowance in there and fold. So 1.5 was sewn with a 3/8 seam allowance. Tends to give me enough fabric to work with, but also not have it to be too bulky in the end. So we're just going to cut strips like this. And the reason you cut them on the bias is because even a woven fabric that doesn't have any stretch side to side will have some stretch on the bias. So So the first thing we're going to do here in sewing our tank top together is we are going to work on the placket. So for the placket here, I have it pressed in half so that you can see the halfway marking with my press with an iron. There, I can talk. And then same with the tank front. So you're just going to match up right sides together of the placket piece and the tank piece so that the center fold line matches up all the way down. And it should just be noted real quick too, I do put interfacing on my placket piece just so that it has a little bit more stability for the placket. You don't have to, it's optional. And then we're going to sew straight down and then across, kind of making like a U shape here in our on our placket. So I tend to use my sewing foot as a guide, sewing straight down the center so that my seam allowance is off to the side. And then when I get to the bottom, I like to keep my needle in the down position so that I can just pivot and sew across the bottom. And what I tend to do is I count how many stitches it takes to get to the center, and then I do that same amount of stitches on the other side of the center so that I'm even from the center fold line, and then sewing back up to the top. So what this has done is this kind of created, like I said, a U or a box without a top along the either side of the center fold line. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut down the center of our fold line. So we're cutting right along that fold line until we get about a ½ inch or so from the bottom. And then instead of cutting straight down, we're going to cut into each corner. What this does is it allows us to turn this right side out, and you do not want to clip through your stitches, so just be careful that you don't clip through them. But you want to cut right to the corner, and this makes it so that when we go to flip it right side out, it will turn right side out for us really nicely and gives us a little bit to sew with later. That little triangle at the bottom is helpful. Okay, so the next part is pressing the placket so that it actually forms a placket. So we're going to walk through this. The first thing to do is I like to just press these seams open and give them a good pressing. It seems almost pointless, but it just makes it so that everything lays really flat when we turn it right side out. So first press those open and then flip the placket to the wrong side or the inside of the tank top. And once again, we're going to fold this open and give it a good press, which should be pretty easy to get a nice clean fold line here since we pressed that seam open first. Okay. So now we're going to take one side and we're going to fold it flat all the way to the other side. Again, press. I press every single step in this. The more you press, the better and crisper it's all going to be. And then you're going to fold it back so that the fold line meets at the opening of the placket edge, and give that a good pressing. And so you see it kind of just comes right to the edge there. And then we're going to just tuck that other end under so that when that folds back, it folds right to the stitch line from our original stitching. And once that's all pressed, we're going to do essentially the exact same thing to the other side, but we'll be folding it back so that it meets at the folded edge of the first side of the placket. So instead of it being at the opening or the gap, it's just going to meet the folded edge. So we're going to fold it back and press, and then we'll tuck it under and press. And again, while you're pressing this, be sure to take the time to really make sure everything is lined up, straight, even. The more time and attention you take to this right now to make sure it's all looking good and lined up, the better looking your placket's going to be when you go to sew it. So give that a good press. And now what you'll see if we turn this around to the front is what looks like a beautiful placket. So it all opens up there. And right now it's not fully determined what's the left and what's the right. So this could be a male or female placket at this point. But we are going to go ahead and just sew these folded edges down. So I do an edge stitch right along the edge of that folded piece, and I just sew it down basically to the bottom of the placket edge there, or as far down as you can sew without pinching and grabbing all the other fabric, because you're not going to sew all the way to the edge of the placket. You're going to sew all the way down to the edge of the opening of the placket, which I hope makes sense. It will make a little bit more sense when you're sewing it. I'm kind of flittering around with the fabric right here, trying to show that to you and realize I couldn't. So right down, you can kind of see the opening there, but you'll just kind of sew down. I'll show you my stitch lines here in a second, and it will hopefully make a little bit more sense. So once you sew one side down, you're just going to turn it and you're going to sew the other side down as well, again sewing right along that folded edge. And because you should be lined up so that that folded edge is essentially right along the ditch, you're kind of stitching in the ditch from the front side. But if it doesn't match up perfectly right in the stitching of the ditch, it's fine. It will all look good when it's done, because everything should still be straight and even. Okay, so what we have here is now is the point where you get to decide whether you're going to do left over right or right over left. I'm doing right over left because this is going to be for my daughter, and that's the female way of opening a placket. So what we're left with here is a placket that opens, and those are all sewn down to the bottom fold there. And you have all of these layers in back. And before I sew, I'm going to sew these together. So I'm just going to line them all up and make sure that little triangle part is facing out. And then I'm just going to sew right along that stitch line that's already showing so that all of these layers at the bottom of the placket are attached to one another, and that secures the placket in place. And then the ends of all of these, I am just going to run through my serger real quick. You can also fold them under, but I just like serging it. It's nice and quick, but it finishes that edge because that will be the inside of the placket. And now what we're going to do is, with that just laying flat, sorry, excuse me, we are going to sew basically an X. So we're going to sew around that tab at the bottom of the placket just to sew it in place. You can also skip this, but then it just kind of flaps around on the inside. My daughter, for one, does not like that much, so I always sew hers down to secure them. It also adds just a little decorative stitching at the bottom of a placket, which a lot of plackets have, but it's up to you. So I just sew a box around all the edge, and I just kind of feel underneath the fabric. Since I'm sewing from the front, I want to make sure it looks good. I feel to make sure that I'm right still on the fabric edge. But I sew a box, and then I sew an X through the box. Again, it's not necessary. I just think it adds a little extra in the look, so I do it. You can skip it if you would like. Okay, so once that is all sewn, you will see that the little tab and back is sewn down, and then you have the cute little decorative sewing in the front. and a placket that opens and is functional. So now your placket is done. The last thing we'll be doing here is adding snaps or buttons. If you're going to do buttons, I recommend doing the buttonholes now. I'm going to do snaps on this one, so I actually am going to add them later once I finish the neck lining, but it is a little bit easier to do buttonholes now. Since I'm going to skip that part, the next step I'm going to do is in the sewing of the tank is sewing the front and back together at the shoulders. So I'm going to just sew these together, and then I'm also going to run them through my serger. Since we are working with woven fabrics, the pain of it is you do have to finish the edges or they will unravel. Okay, so now we have these lovely arm curves, and we are going to finish them with the bias strips that we cut out. So if you use the pattern is just a guide, so it's going to give you a strip that's longer than you need, which is good. And if you're not working with a pattern but you're just finishing the armholes as with bias as you want, just cut bias longer than you need. And then you working with the right side, you're going to just do right sides together with the bias tape to the arm opening. And this is how I do the binding, where I'm flipping the binding all the way to the inside. With the neck, when we get to that, I'll show you what happens when you bind it. So this one is going to be more like banding to the inside, or like, oh, there's a term for it, I'm sure, blanking on it. But all of the bias will be flipped to the inside. So I'm doing right sides together for it to be all turned to the inside. And then the neckline, I'll show you a different way of finishing it so that you have options. So I'm just gonna pin the bias binding in place. Try not to stretch it too much because it will stretch, but it bends, because of the stretch, it bends around the curves, which is really nice. Now that this is all pinned in place, I'm just going to sew all the way along the edge, again using a 3/8 seam allowance as I have with the whole tank. Okay, so now that it's all sewn in place is when I will trim any extra bias binding. So I have it laying flat with the tank, and I just trim it to match the shaping of the tank top, so it flares out a little bit, so my bias will flare out a little bit. So I'm just going to trim off the extra there. And now we will go and press the binding. Okay, so for pressing the binding, again, the first thing I do is I press open the seam. I know it's going to seem like one more added step here because it's not 100% necessary, but I do think it's necessary. I press everything over and over again, as I told you, and skipping on the pressing is just going to result in a look that looks kind of sloppy in the end. So if you want a really clean, nicely finished garment, don't skip the pressing. I press the seam open, and then I'm going to press the seam allowance all towards the bias. The reason I press it open first and then press it towards the bias is because pressing it open gives a nice crisp edge, and then pressing it towards just adds to it, so instead of ending up with a bubble. Then we're going to take that edge of the bias that's away from the bodice, and we're going to fold it down kind of in half so that that raw edge just comes to the stitch line. And we're going to give that a good pressing. And this pressing that we are doing is really as a marker at this point, because it's easier to fold it down before you sew the side seam. But we will be unfolding this step to sew up the side seam. And don't worry about that little bit of bias that's hanging off the edge there, because it will all make sense when we're sewing up the side seam. Okay, so we're going to unfold our bias now, and we're going to match up the edges of the bias and the side seam there, so that every edge should match. And now once we sew up that side, which I didn't show you, but it's just sewing a straight line, we're going to press the side seam nice and flat and then refold the bias with the fold that we already pressed in. So it's already there, so the in half bias band. And then fold and tuck the whole bias to the inside, which is also pressed because it was the first pressing that we did. And so now it should all tuck nicely in, and we're going to sew right along that edge. Okay, so this is what it looks like when it's all done. So I sewed right along that inside edge, and the bias is all tucked along the inside and looks perfect and cute. And now we are just going to have to do the exact same thing to the other side of the tank. Okay, so we have both arms sewn now, and I'm going to show you a different technique for sewing binding that is kind of like half and half, or sewn towards the fronts. You can see some of it, and that's with doing the neckline. So the first thing with the neck binding is that we are sewing the right side to the wrong side, so the inside of the neck binding. And then because we have the placket here, the binding actually folds over the edge of the front of the placket. And I do this so that I get a nice finished edge on my binding after it's sewn. So fold it over the front of the edge, and then we're just going to work our way again around the neckline here. Try not to stretch or pull your binding too much, or it will kind of pucker your neckline. But remember that bias is cut on the fold or on the bias grain, so it has a nice bend or curve to it, and it will go around the neckline really well for you. Versus if it was like a straight grain that you cut the binding on, and so it was just either up and down or side to side grain line. What you'll have is like a binding that puckers and doesn't want to curve. So to get the curve, we go with the bias grain. And we are going to continue pinning all the way around, and then you'll notice that when I get to the end here, my bias binding is too long for the neckline, which is good. I like having it long. I'm going to fold it back and kind of mark how much more I need folded over, and then I'm just going to trim the rest of it off to shorten it. I like working with bias binding that's too long rather than too short, so I cut all of mine longer than I need, and every neckline is different as how much it needs, so just work around it. Okay, so now we're going to sew this all in place, which I did. So I sewed with a 3/8 seam allowance, and then I just pulled the bias up straight. So you can see I have this little like folded edge, and I'm going to fold it in and then fold the bias down, but to the raw edge instead of all the way to the stitch line. And then I'm going to fold that down again so that the folded edge comes down to the stitch line. And that's how you'll end up seeing like a tuck of the bias binding along the front side or the right side of the garment instead of the other one that tucked all the way in. And we'll do the same thing to both sides of the neckline here, where it just kind of like double tucks in. And so now I'm going to go and press and sew that. So it's sewn the same way. You're sewing along that folded edge, but what you're ended up with is a bias that's not seen on the inside, but is seen on the outside. So if that kind of makes sense there. It's just two different ways to show off the binding, and it gives kind of a different look. You could do the same thing to both or mix it up like I have here. Next, we're going to add the snaps to the front. I only add 2 because this is a small placket. The placket is really only made to help with dressing, opening up over the head if needed. So I just needed 2 snaps. And the last thing you're going to do is hem the bottom of the tank top, which is another thing I'm not really showing you in this step, but it's pretty self-explanatory. You tuck it under and then sew. I did use my cover stitch for this to finish the inside. But that's it. Then you are done with your tank top.